Our study this evening is Jehoram, and a prophet that prophesied during Jehoram's reign in Judah. And to get us a little bit of a mental picture, we have been, of course, looking mostly at Israel for the last several lessons, except for last week, and we did look at Jehoshaphat. And tonight we're looking at Jehoshaphat's son, which, if you will notice, the little indention here and of course here indicates that there is some overlap in the reign of some of these kings, and that appears to be the case concerning Jehoshaphat and his son Jehoram. And let's make sure that we do not confuse Joram, or as some translations translated Jehoram, who was a king of Israel, with this king of Jehoram that we're studying, who is, of course, the king of Judah. Jehoram of Judah was the oldest son of Jehoshaphat, and he turns out to be the fifth king that the divided kingdom of Judah had since the division occurred following Solomon. We read all of this in 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 3. It's in 2 Kings chapter 8 that we find that Jehoram was 32 years old when he began to reign, and that he reigned for 8 years, though, as we've said, apparently he began reigning while his father was still on the throne. Two, another thing to keep in mind, Jehoram's wife was Athaliah, and the significance of that is she was the daughter of Ahab, and of course we know who Ahab married. He married Jezebel. So here is now the king of Judah having married the daughter of the king of Israel, which of course we studied Ahab and found very little good that we could make mention of him through his entire reign of several decades. So this is where we need to realize what makes Jehoram's reign sometimes described in the scriptures being like unto the reign of Ahab. Another thing, Jehoram made sure that he was going to remain king. He kills all of his brothers that we read about in 2 Chronicles 21. And it seems to be the nature of most kings. I don't know if you could say it's the power that corrupts them or what it is, but remember, even when Jesus was born, the wise men and others were making the statement that the king of the Jews has been born. Well, Herod wanted to know immediately where Jesus was. He sent the wise men to seek out Jesus under the impression that I want to go worship him, while all the truth in the matter was he wanted to kill him because he was a threat, or he seemed to be a threat to his throne. So here we see an example of that in Jehoram. He kills all of his brothers, and that pretty much assures him of being able to remain on the throne. And despite the evil in Jehoram's life, the Lord did not destroy the house of David completely due to the covenant that God had with David. We may find mention of that in 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 7. But what we need to understand is this covenant that God made with David goes further back than that. It goes all the way back to Abraham. It was reaffirmed to Isaac. It was reaffirmed to Jacob. It was reaffirmed to David. And so God has a promise to keep. And that's why we have an evil king now reigning over Judah, but He's not going to completely be wiped out because of that promise. God never has, never will break his promises. Judah, we do know, however, will ultimately be brought down. But it's going to be by God's wisdom. It's going to be in God's time. And while we were studying Jehoram's reign, the time has not yet come for that to happen. We still see good kings, bad kings in Judah. And what we've seen so far with Israel is no good kings. So we're going to learn that Israel falls, Assyria captures and takes Israel into captivity, never to return, while the nation of Judah continues. Some bad kings, some good kings, but ultimately, God has to be the just God that he is and cause Judah to go into captivity. But again, because of this covenant, because of this promise, Judah will be recovered and brought out of captivity until it would be that, of course, the ultimate promise that through Abraham's seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. To just do a little bit of a summary of Jeroboam's reign, we find one of those summaries mentioned in 2 Kings 8 and verse 18. Brother Byron, I think I started over here last week. Let's start over here. Read 2 Kings 8, verse 18 for us.
And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done, and the daughter of Ahab was his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord.
And of course, we've said that 1st and 2nd Kings has somewhat of a parallel in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So it's also in 2nd Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 6, Brother Rex, that we read this about the reign of Jehoram.
And he walked in the way of kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For he had the daughter of Ahab as a wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord.
So here we're seeing that he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Even specific mention made of probably the most wicked king of Israel, and that would be Ahab. So, at first, we might wonder, well, how in the world would the king of Judah be so influenced to follow the ways of Ahab, who is the king of another nation? And of course, what we have to remember is the statement that's found in both 2 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 21. We must remember, it says, for the daughter of Ahab was Jehoram's wife. It was during Jehoram's reign that Edom makes war with Judah. And this we find in 2 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 21. Edom, if you remember, is a relative of Israel, of all of the nation, both divided and united, all of the 12 tribes, if we go all the way back to the united kingdom of Israel. So Edom is a relative, and Edom is a neighbor, just a little bit to the southeast of Judah. And the reason how it is that they are relatives is they are descendants of Esau. We know the promise, the lineage, was to continue through Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac. Jacob was the one from whom had 12 sons that eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel, making up the nation of Israel. So we see then that Esau and Jacob were brothers. And so Esau's descendants were Edomites. So now we see that Edom is making war, but this war is or was a fulfillment of a statement that Isaac foretold many centuries before, back there in Genesis chapter 27, verses 39 and 40. Reuben, read that voice.
And Isaac his father answered and said to him, Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck.
So here's what Isaac, the father of Jacob and Esau, says to Esau. And now, generations later, we're seeing Edom come up against the nation of Judah. And not only that, but it's during this same time, during this same period of time, that we have the prophet Obadiah comes into the picture. Obadiah is one of those books that's hard to find in the Old Testament when you go looking for it. But it's among those that we refer to as the minor prophets, not minor in the sense of less important, less significant, but minor from the standpoint of the size, the shortness of their books. And of course, as I mentioned last Wednesday night when I had Obadiah down for our study, don't get bent out of shape because there's no chapters in Obadiah, there's just 21 verses. So Obadiah is one of those minor prophets because he is small in comparison to Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of the other prophets. But now we see Obadiah comes into the picture. And in reading those verses from verses 10 through 14, we see that when Edom rebelled against Jehoram and Judah, that also the Philistines and the Arabians were invading Jerusalem. So you might say that Edom just took advantage of the opportunity. Not that Edom initiated, but since these two nations were already going against Judah, Edom thought, good chance, good opportunity here. So when all through 2 Chronicles, and although 2 Chronicles doesn't mention the Edomites' involvement, Obadiah 1, verses 10 through 14, describes Edom's actions during this time, during this period. They carried out violence against their own relatives, not just their neighbors, but their relatives. They waited on nearby roads to kill those of the nation of Judah as they would escape or try to leave Jerusalem. So they were relentless in what they were doing against their neighbors, against their own flesh and blood. The Edomites could have easily heard of Jerusalem's invasion by these foreign powers for the very simple reason that Edom was not a very strong nation to begin with. In fact, remember when Isaiah prophesied to Esau, he would live with a sword. And in fact, the majority of the book of Obadiah pronounces judgment on the nation of Edom. Obadiah's his primary focus points to a significant and a difficult truth, really, about mankind's relationship with God. And if you were to sum up those 21 verses in Obadiah, I believe it would be this. When people place themselves in opposition to God's people, they can expect judgment to come upon them. Edom had been found guilty of pride. This is what Obadiah prophesies against them in verse 3. They had thought themselves greater than they really were. They thought themselves great enough to mock, to steal, and even to harm God's chosen people. But it's interesting that the book of Obadiah opens up with verse 1 by declaring the Lord God. And what have we always said about that word Lord? Ruler, isn't it? Not just God, but ruler. And what he's doing here, obviously, is that he's stressing God's absolute, God's sovereign power over the nations. And he will not stand by and let his people suffer forever. That is pretty much how the book of Obadiah starts, there in verse 1. And I believe we can also see this true of other instances. Think, for example, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. Christians were under persecution of Rome, the Roman government. And remember there was that statement over in Revelation chapter 6 that it said in verse 10, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you judge and avenge our blood on those that dwell on the earth?" So I could not help but to think of that verse, to think of what the situation here is with Edom, their own relatives, their own kinfolks, and yet the things that they're doing against Judah. So, here's another thing we see. Through Obadiah, God reminded Edom of the poor treatment of his people. That's in verses 12 through 14. And he promises redemption, not to Edom, but redemption to Judah. And that we see in verses 17 and 18. Brother Glenn, read those two verses for us.
But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau shall be stubble, and they shall kindle them and devour them. And no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken.
So that's Obadiah's prophecy. We see that he makes mention of Jacob, he makes mention of Joseph, he makes mention of Esau, which of course is who are descendants of Esau. But it says, they shall be stubble, they shall kindle them and devour them. No survivors shall remain of the house of Esau. Why? For the Lord has spoken. So, what we have here in these verses is that in what Obadiah reminds them, we see the nation of the nation of Edom, it will eventually disappear into history. And it remains one of the great examples of a statement that we so often are maybe reminded of in Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. But now let's go back to Jehoram. Sad to say, he did not follow the example of his father, Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, you remember, had put forth a great effort to bring God's people back to the Lord, to turn them from idols. In 2 Chronicles 19 and verse 4, we studied that last week. And Jehoram, on the other hand, we find in 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 11, led Judah astray by idolatry. So, what a difference. a totally different direction does Jehoram take Judah compared to what Jehoshaphat, his father, was trying to do. The exact opposite of what his father was trying to accomplish. And we have Elijah still on the scene. Elijah had prophesied the manner in which Jehoram and his family would be made to suffer because of his ungodliness and the evil influence that Jehoram had on Israel. We see that in verses 12 through 15 of 2 Chronicles 21. What I want us to see is that Jehoram was struck sick and died in a very terrible manner, which Elijah had prophesied there in verses 12 through 15. But I want us to read verses 18 and 19. Nick?
After all this, the Lord struck him in his intestines with an incredible disease. Then it happened in the course of time, after the end of 2 years, that his intestines came out because of his sickness. So he died in severe pain. And his people made no burning for him like the burning for his fathers.
It's interesting that this is the only mention that's made of Elijah in the Chronicles, First or Second Chronicles. While for the most part we know that Elijah was a prophet to Israel, prophesying during Elijah and the contest on Mount Carmel, most of what we read about Elijah when we studied about him pertained to the children of Israel, to the nation of Judah. But what I think this helps us to see is that he was not only concerned with the affairs of Israel, but of Judah as well. Because here we have him making this prophecy to Jehoram in regard to the evil that he has brought upon Judah. So when Jehoram died, it happened just like Elijah said. And another interesting thing is that he was not missed by the nation of Judah, nor was Jehoram buried in the tombs of the kings. So, what a sad commentary on his life and on his reign over God's people. Let us always realize the importance of the Old Testament and how we still have it. We still have it with us. It's for our learning. As I've had this passage, Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, on every slide that I've had. Not on every slide, but on the slide of every lesson that we have had. So let us realize the importance of our studying these characters, these individuals, good or bad, and the lessons that we can learn from them. So what are the lessons that we can learn from Jehoram? And I should have put Obadiah up there. One lesson is we must not do as Jehoram in that he had forsaken the Lord God. 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 10. But we know it happens, don't we? But there's no justifiable reason for any human being ever doing such. Forsaking the Lord. You know, there may be a number of factors which influences a person to leave the Lord. He might give a number of excuses. He might point fingers at others. But the bottom line is this: a person departs from God because his heart is not truly devoted to God. All other things considered, that's really what it comes down to. The hearts are not truly devoted to God. Jehoram's killing of his brothers, it was unjustified. And what we see here is that for their own selfish interest, some people are willing to take every sort of unlawful action when they feel that it will help them to accomplish their goals. There's nothing they won't do. And this is what Jehoram did. He had a goal that he wanted to make sure, he had a position that he wanted to make sure he was going to maintain. And whatever it took to maintain it, or at least to give him assurance of maintaining it. No holds barred, even to the killing of his own brothers. And Jehoram's marriage. Here's where another lesson we see. Jehoram's marriage played a role in his corruption and in the corruption of the nation of Judah. 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 6. Why did he act like Ahab's family? Remember we asked that question a moment ago. Why would a king of Judah act like the king of Israel when they're two separate nations? And we found out what the reason was, wasn't it? He married Ahab's daughter. So why did he act like Ahab's family? Because he'd married one of them. He married Ahab's daughter, Ahab and Jezebel daughter. And think about this. He married Athaliah, and at some point later, he forsook the Lord. Think about that. He marries, and then later he departs. Do you see the connection between those two facts? Here's the general rule. In fact, I also believe it to be the universal rule. After one gets married, a person's spouse influences him or her more than any other person in the world. Anybody deny that? No, because we know it's true. We know the pull, we know the influence. We know the bond that takes place between a man and a woman in marriage. And because of that, influence is tremendous. And we see it in Jehoram. We saw it in Solomon, did we not? So, that being the case, shouldn't this cause a child of God to choose a spouse deliberately and with great care, having his or her own best spiritual interest in mind, as well as the spiritual interest of their children? Chances are in a marriage, it's not going to be just husband and wife very long. There's going to be children. So again, whoever has that predominant influence in that family, it's not only going to affect the marriage, it's going to affect the family. By family, I mean children that are born. So we must not, as Jehoram did, and that was to forsake the Lord. No excuses justify. Not even a bad marriage justifies forsaking the Lord. Another lesson is having a righteous father does not guarantee his child will be righteous. Nor can a person or rather, nor can a son inherit his father's relationship with God. I don't know of a better passage to see that than over there with what Ezekiel said in chapter 18. If you read verse 4, it says, the soul who sins shall die. And that's an important statement. Because the reason I know it's important, it's repeated in verse 20. The soul that sins, it shall die. But back down that verse 4, it says the soul of the Son is God. The soul of the Father is God. What I take that to mean is Son and Father stand on their own two legs before God. And then the very next verse, verse 5, says, the Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. So we, each and every one, are responsible for our own actions. And this is where this very popular doctrine that we still have very much with us today is that we inherit the sin of our ancestor Adam. We do no such thing. Now we've inherited the consequence of his sin. The consequence of sin is death. Death passed upon all men, physical death, as a result of sin being introduced into the world. So yes, we may have to suffer the consequences of our father's sins, but never the guilt. The soul that sins, it shall die. So a son does not inherit the father's relationship with God, and we see that Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram, walked in the good ways of David. But Jehoram, his son, failed to walk in the ways of his father. Each of us is accountable to the Lord as an individual. Another lesson we can learn is that evil people's actions are contagious. Jehoram himself was ungodly in his conduct, and under his rule, the people of Judah committed harlotry. And even more tragic is the truth that the king himself actually led them astray, because here's the way it's written in verse 11 of 2 Chronicles 21. He caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to commit harlotry and led Judah astray. So it's a serious offense to be exactly what Jehoram was to Judah. He was a stumbling block. And Jesus talked about that in Luke chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. Arden, read that for us.
It is impossible that no offense should come, but woe to him through whom they do come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than that he should offend one of these little ones, or to lead them away from the path of righteousness. Right.
All right. See how serious? 1 minute. It's a serious matter to cause someone else to lose their faith, to destroy their faith. That's what Jehoram did to Israel. It's what he did to himself. But Jesus says this is such a serious thing that we still need to be reminded of it today. Our actions are contagious. Evil is contagious. Righteousness is to be contagious. But I don't know, it just seems like that evil has got a little bit more of an edge of being more contagious than righteousness is, seemingly. But evil people's actions are contagious. And from Obadiah, a lesson that we can learn is the destructive power of pride. You know, it reminds us of the consequences of living in a self-serving manner, of following through on our own feelings and desires without considering their effect on those around us. Do we struggle to set aside our own wants and desires for those of God and others? Though pride, we know, has been a part of the human race since the Garden of Eden, Obadiah offers us a simple but blunt reminder to place ourselves under God's authority, to subject our appetites to His purposes, and to find our hope in being His people. How many times have you heard lessons on 3 John applied to Genesis 3? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the pride of life. All three of them were present in the garden when Eve was tempted by Satan. The pride of life, the vainglory, as one translation says, of life. Let's be reminded of 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. Brother David, read that for us.
But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light.
Let's don't forget who we are. I guess to sum up 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, that's as easy of a summary as I can come up with. Let's not forget who we are. So in conclusion of our study, like all of us, Jehoram had great potential. He had many opportunities to use his blessings and position to serve the Lord, to help God's people, to do the very same thing. And for the most part, in this area, he failed miserably. And he had no one to blame but himself. So I guess after all of the 35 lessons that we've looked at thus far, maybe this is a good question to ask. Are we learning the lessons in our study of these characters? And you see, indeed, we've seen many characters, and we've seen many lessons, more than just one lesson, in nearly all of these characters. So, Lord willing, next week we will look at King Jehu, and we can read about him in 2 Kings in chapters 9 and chapters 10. Anyone want to add anything? Any men that add something that maybe would be of help to what we have studied concerning Jehoram? I do.
Although he led
Yes.
the people away, they were still responsible.
Yeah,
I think it's the one thing
that's right.
we have to make,
We still bear responsibility,
no matter what.
no matter. Good. Thank you so much.